will get that running, but if not, I may as well start the slides. I think we'll be able to figure that part out. So I'm Brian Czech, and I want to thank Elytris for inviting me to address the group. It's been a while since I've spoken to a primarily wildlife group. I'm a wildlife biologist from way back. I was a certified wildlife biologist beginning, I believe, in 1988, right after my master's research on elk at Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. But then I kind of broadened my studies to conservation biology and public policy and what we might call the ecological macroeconomics of wildlife conservation. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is focused on that. And you'll be seeing some stuff that was prohibited from coming out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, at least when I worked there. I was in headquarters for almost 20 years and literally prohibited from talking about the trade-off between growing the economy and conserving wildlife. So let's talk about it here at least, and then you can judge for yourself whether or not that should be something we should avoid or actually should focus on. So let's see if I'll be able to share the screen, and I'll count on somebody to enable that because it says host disabled screen sharing. Let's see, how else could I do that? Well, Elytris, if you at any point find the part of the menu bar, okay, now we can see Elytris screen. Now, if mine can be enabled, okay, I'll try share screen. Now I think you have to approve mine somehow, Elytris. There we go. Can anybody else hear me? And if so, can you tell me if any kind of screen sharing is happening yet?
Can hear you, but no screen share yet.
Okay, thank you. So let's see. I assume Elytris heard that, but Elytris. Okay, let me try it again, folks. Share screen. There we go. Good job, Elytris. It looks like this is going to work now. All right, wildlife and GDP don't mix. And maybe that one fella can let me know, is it working now?
I'm not seeing your screen share. I'm seeing just Zoom.
I'm seeing Elytris's, I think.
Wow. Because mine shows an option to stop sharing as if it's sharing it right now.
Now we got it.
We got it?
Now
Okay,
it's there.
Okay, so part of it may just be a connectivity thing, you know, in the ether or whatever, but so you're seeing a slide, Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy?
Yes.
Okay, now let me go to the beginning, put it on slideshow, and here we go. It should say wildlife and GDP don't mix, cutting our conservation losses in the 21st century. All right, so the basic approach here is definitely going to be big picture, long term. We're not going to be talking about an elk population here, a deer population there, or a hawk population. We're talking about wildlife in the aggregate. And so basically, we're talking about biodiversity, definitely at the species level and beyond, biodiversity at large. Similarly, we're going to be talking about the economy as a whole. We're not going to be delving into little microeconomic case studies. And we're dealing with systemic processes that have major relevance to huge public policy issues. And all right, so biodiversity, just as a reminder, is the variety of life, and that encompasses levels all the way from the molecular to the landscape. And in conservation biology, and when I was helping to develop an accounting system for biodiversity in the United States, doing that on a detail with the USGS, we were focusing on at the genome, species, and ecosystem levels. And of course, in the wildlifers, we tend to focus a lot at population levels as well. And let's start connecting it from the get-go with economics and with the economy at large. An ecosystem, let's say a pine forest, is going to be simultaneously a stock and a fund. It's a stock from which flow goods and goods from intermediate to final, and it's a fund from which flow services from intermediate to final. And these are valuable final products, final goods and services. Now, this great scholar, Barton Perry, wrote in the 1950s in a very famous paper at the time that we have to recognize that there are realms of value, he called them. And we're dealing today, at least in policy relevance, primarily in the economics realm, because if you look at the list, you don't see any that are devoted to biodiversity or wildlife. And it's not likely that economics is the natural fit. So therefore, we start to see some hints already that GDP and wildlife don't mix all that well. And he also stated that the most important things cannot be measured. And I think we wildlifers totally get that too. What's the price of a polar bear as a species disappearing off the end of the planet in the process of climate change and so on, all the extinctions already? Okay, but now let's go back for a moment to the concept of biodiversity, because this is biodiversity too. In fact, the two on top are actually wildlife species when they're in the wild, at least. Here we have plants, a plant ecosystem of sorts, and a different animal species that's way out of the wild by now, maybe a different kind of wild. So I think we have to add a qualifier that biodiversity is a variety of life in a state of relative ecological integrity. Again, encompassing levels from the molecular to the landscape. And I think it's something that we know when we see. We know relatively high ecological integrity with biodiversity and relatively low with low biodiversity, even though there may be all kinds of, rats and starlings and such. All right, now let's hone in a little bit on the process of economic growth, which is an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. So it's not just, maybe bicycles here or cantaloupes there. It's the whole integrated economy, and it's typically expressed in terms of gross domestic product or GDP. And it entails an increasing population and or per capita production and consumption. And that's a really key phrase to keep in mind, that it's production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. We're dealing with the macroeconomy here. And I think the relevance of that is going to become very apparent to wildlifers if it's not already. Now here's, this goes back to some of my earliest efforts at analyzing the ecological macroeconomics of wildlife conservation. Economic growth is a process of reallocating the natural capital, the woods, the waters, the soils, the fisheries, the minerals, and so on, from the economy of nature, where all of that natural capital had simply comprised wildlife habitats, on over to the human economy, where that natural capital is transformed into producer and consumer goods. The Wildlife Society was in on this when off the press came this special issue on that reallocation of natural capital. And this is a collage that speaks thousands of words. The old editor, Rooney, from the Wildlife Society came up with this. It's fantastic. It shows an economy coming out of the wilderness, growing sort of in a sigmoid fashion, approaching a carrying capacity. And it's developing its structure from the agro-extractive into the urban core. And it starts out by endangering these large-bodied K-selected species, and little by little, it's into every little nook and cranny of the economy of nature, so it's endangering the little R-selected species as well. The American Fisheries Society was testing the waters on the topic for a year or two also, and they had a pretty succinct logo to describe the fundamental conflict between economic growth and fish conservation. But you know what? We have to have at least a little bit of sense of how GDP is calculated and what it really represents in order to be able to talk shop on this. So let's just have a mini lesson on national income accounting. GDP technically is the monetary value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. That's the most typical application, annually for a country. The part that always applies is the monetary value of all final goods and services. And a final good is a good that's consumed rather than used in the production of another good. Now, this simple equation is called the fundamental identity of national income accounting, telling us that production is or equals income equals expenditure. Production equals income equals expenditure. And so these are the three methods by which the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis calculates GDP, through value of production, derivation of income, and expenditure of money. On final, to mention the circular flow of the economy, with money being spent by firms primarily on the labor of households, and households spending money primarily on the goods and services from firms. So here's the real money flow. Real simply means adjusted for inflation. So you have the money going between firms and households for the goods and the factors of production, primarily labor. And that, we'll come back to that. It's a very, very relevant sort of concept. But once again, it's not the production or income or expenditure on anything. It's the production of final goods and services, the income from final goods and services, and the expenditure on final goods and services. So that, for example, is not GDP. Every pull of that, the bandit handle there, that's not GDP. The entire night at a casino may be calculated in GDP, but not every single transaction, not by a long shot. And so, you know, like the trading of derivatives on a stock exchange floor, none of that goes into GDP. So let's not get the stock exchange, for example, confused with the real economy, which GDP measures. You might look at it this way. GDP is like the big river of economic action. It's not the oxbows and the whirlpools and stuff like that. Now, you people as wildlifers, we as wildlifers, we have some conceptual tools in the toolbox that are extremely relevant to the relationship between economic growth and wildlife conservation. And this is one of them, our knowledge about trophic levels, where, you know, first we have plants that produce, then we have primary consumers that consume, and secondary consumers that consume primary, and omnivores, you know, through here, and various service providers that can both land within a particular trophic level and sometimes are primarily known for being, you know, maybe somewhere else, like scavengers or detritivores down here. And the human economy has to follow the same basic rules. You know, we're Homo sapiens, part of that economy of nature. So we have producers, primary consumers, and secondary consumers. And these are those. Agro-extractive sectors are the producers. And then the consumers range from heavy to light. And then we have a very highly developed set of service providers, given the tremendous amount of surplus at this level. And that's going to be one of the main points. Oh yeah, in fact, this leads to what we call the trophic theory of money. And well, I'm actually quoting myself here from a 2019 paper on the trophic theory of money. The trophic theory of money is that money originates via the agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor unto the manufacturing and service sectors. I would imagine that makes great common sense to us in this audience. And the primary corollary then is that the quantity of money and GDP, which is a flow, like that river, like the river metaphor helped to demonstrate, it's a flow of money, expenditure, income, it's a flow of money. That indicates the amount of agricultural and extractive surplus, and therefore the environmental impact of the economy. Now, that's all been pretty theoretical. Let's take a look at what it looks like on the ground. This is what it's starting to look like in more and more agricultural landscape, extremely intense factory-type farming, with water being utilized to the max in many regions of the earth. This happens to be pivot agriculture over Kansas, being flown over above Kansas. There it is in the upper right in Saudi Arabia. But the lower right shows us that just about everywhere, even in parts of the world where there's plenty of water, if there's also agriculturally productive soils, there's a tremendous amount of competition for the quantity and quality of water. And we go and we see why, you know, like what is it, something like 40–50% of the water in California is used for livestock production. And, you know, we find that in a lot of areas, wildlife is at a low ebb because of things like overgrazing and, you know, and factory farming and logging, of course, especially with clear-cut logging and mining, and including the extraction of energy, fossil fuels in particular, as well as other forms of energy. And it's only when we have plenty of that kind of activity that we're going to have plenty of heavy manufacturing. And we do have plenty of heavy manufacturing like that. And then you get the lighter forms of manufacturing, all the way up to things like computer chip and manufacture. And of course, none of this happens without an increasing amount of infrastructure. So that's part of the game. You might call it sort of the heaviest of all, manufacturing. And then we come to the so-called information economy as sort of the pinnacle of the service sectors. But the main point that I want to make in this talk is that all this provision of information, it's not going to matter at all in terms of GDP unless the information is being purchased by the other regular old non-information sectors. So it's kind of what we called in a recent podcast a slippery shibboleth, to refer to the information economy, because it's the same old economy but with more computer technology, which just allows for ever more extraction and agro surplus. And then, of course, we have the end of the tailpipe as a result of the second law of thermodynamics. There will be an end of the tailpipe, and there will be systemic pollution, and there will be, as a pure matter of probability, increasing numbers and disaster levels of major episodes as well, like the BP oil spill. Now let's take a quick look at what conventional economic growth theory has to say about growth. Conventional growth theory has gone through several major stages, but all of it revolves around the Solow model, which Robert Solow produced in 1956, especially, and it revolves around this production function that says production is a function of capital and labor. And, you know, as some indication of the overlooking of land, you know, land should have been a distinct factor in this production function. It's not there at all. And so that's what led people like Solow to say things like the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources. And then this type of thinking was taken to extremes, and still is, believe me, here by Robert Bradley, who at an awards banquet, no less, for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, told us that natural resources originate from the mind, not from the ground, and therefore are not depletable. So, of course, what they're talking about is the process of technological progress. And hopefully sometime we can reassemble here, and I'd like to give you the whole deal about technological progress, because it's kind of complicated a little bit. But I'll try to make the main point here, which is that technological progress comes not as manna from heaven. It comes from heavy investment in research and development. And that just, that's not manna from heaven either. The money isn't. I mean, there has to be funding for that R&D. And in the private sector, that's called profits. You know, it's after the factors of production have been paid off, the wages and the rents and the interest and so on, then excess or profit can be spent on R&D. And in the public sector, we might just call this economic surplus, can be put into R&D. Now, the thing about profits is economists of all ilks, and I'm sorry there's not a better, greater diversity here, but, you know, this has kind of been the field of economics, and profits dry up. They've all described that in very systemic terms, that profits dry up in any sort of non-monopolistic economy, except for who? Well, there is an exception, and that's for the firm that can somehow manage to maintain a competitive advantage. And how is that? How does that happen? Well, through the process of R&D. But if you may have noticed something, we're kind of back where we started. And that means we may have kind of a catch-22 here, because we're saying that we need the profits to conduct the R&D, but we need the R&D to maintain the profits. So what's going on here? It's like a chicken and egg conundrum. Well, to get straight to the bottom line, so to speak. This is the factor that's always overlooked in these discussions. Hang on, folks. I just heard a beep. So I want to make sure that that's not Elytras trying to call in here. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
okay,
hear
good.
you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, that's not me. All right, then. So economies of scale, that's what allows for this process to continue for the time being, at least. Economies of scale are simply increased efficiency, but necessarily, by definition, with increased production using existing technology. And it applies at all levels of the economy, micro to macro and local to global. Here's an example. Same basic technology, internal combustion engine, single hull draft, so on, even similar types of containers. But this one is way more efficient than that one, of course. But does that look more sustainable? Of course not. So that helps us to recognize why there is that fundamental conflict between economic growth and wildlife conservation, because we can't escape it via technological progress, because technological progress ultimately depends upon increasing the enterprise progress. I hope that makes sense. If not, shoot me an email. I'll send you a paper on it. There's a chapter in my book, Supply Shock, on this phenomenon. Now let's talk a little bit about GDP and how a wildlifer might think of optimizing GDP. I think that hopefully most of us in the wildlife society and the wildlife profession realize, especially by now, that GDP growth isn't sustainable. And of course, degrowth isn't sustainable either. And so that leaves this option, which we call the steady state economy. And, let's look at it pre-COVID-19. It was about a $20 trillion American GDP. It was an $89 trillion global GDP. Do we consider that to be the optimum level? Well, I don't know about you, but I didn't. I'm down here. I miss what I call the good old days. And I'm not talking about, a 57 Chevy. I'm talking about big, wide open spaces, yet relatively wide open, where I could ride horseback from Arizona up to Idaho like I did in 1983. I would never even think of that now. And, but we have others, on the other hand, who would probably even like a higher GDP, more New York cities, more Mexico cities, more Beijings, and so on, and theme parks, etc. So what we like to say at CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, is that this is the single biggest challenge for democracy in the 21st century. That is taking all this diversity of background and interest and ethics and concern for posterity and finding and achieving the optimum GDP in a democratic fashion, no less. What a challenge. Here's another way of looking at it, which is that as GDP grows, it's a great thing for a while. It's what we would call smart growth. But once it's beyond the optimum, because of things like species going extinct and green space disappearing and stress increasing, traffic increasing, competition for resources, resource wars occurring, well, that's got to be some kind of stupid. And I think that we see a lot of that today, a lot of reactions to crises that have been caused by growth, resulting in efforts to grow the economy even more. And yeah, once again, that would have to fall in that category. Well, if we are going to attempt to identify this optimum size of GDP, then there are a number of different metrics that are helpful. GDP itself is a helpful metric. I mean, it's the thing that tells us the size of the economy. But as wildlifers, we need to keep in mind that GDP is also, and it's becoming even more important as an indicator of environmental impact. Not even an indicator, it's a measure, just like it's a measure of the size of the economy. It is a measure of environmental impact because of that trophic structure of the human economy and because technological progress is not manna from heaven. And but we have many other indicators like various reformed sorts of GDP calculations, the ecological footprint, genuine savings, living planet index, etc. It's not going to be part of our deal here today to hone in very far on any of these. Might be worth noting that at least lately, in the past 10 to 15 years, there have been some international precedents toward recognizing that, well, toward recognizing this, you know, that maybe we're into stupid growth now. And so we have countries like Bhutan providing leadership, you know, little Bhutan providing leadership, symbolic and literally in macroeconomic policy, striving for gross national happiness and rejecting the pursuit of GDP. And then most recently was New Zealand rejecting the goal of GDP in its next budget. So we're almost done here now, folks. I think that, let's see. Oh, it's not too late yet. Well, we have a couple more minutes, so I might as well say a thing or two yet about inflation, because people may be wondering a couple of things. They may be wondering, well, yeah, what about inflation? Isn't that going to affect the relationship of GDP to biodiversity? And yes, but don't forget, we're talking about real GDP. So it's adjusted for inflation. But that said, you may have some concerns about inflation just from a personal financial sense. And in any event, it's going to be a big topic coming up soon. So let's remind ourselves of the circular flow of money that is spent on factors of production and goods and services. And inflation is measured via the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which can be viewed as like a basket of goods and services, with the primary categories being food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, and education and communication. So see, this is real stuff. You can place all of it in the trophic structure pretty readily. And what American economic policy is all about is what's called balanced growth. This is where we have the real economy growing as reflected by the flow of money and the stock of money, the money supply, in other words, the M0, M1 money supply in particular. And so balanced growth, it's not just some loose concept that our monetary and fiscal authorities follow sort of instinctively. No, it's part of the very title of the centerpiece of macroeconomic policy in the United States, which is the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978. And so, by the way, we at CASI, and I hope we can get wildlifers to help in this, we are attempting to reform, to get the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act amended into what we call the Full Seas Act, to indicate that the rising tide lifts all boats is an outdated metaphor. There's no room for more boats. There's no more water to route for more tide rising, that kind of thing. But the technical title would be the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. All right, now back to the process of inflation. This would be the most typical sort of process. The money supply is growing faster than the real economy is. And this could be simply as a result of careless, reckless, or politicized monetary policy in the Federal Reserve System. Conversely, we can have the money supply stable, but we can have the real economy shrinking, right? And so when COVID-19 struck, I think we can see that certainly this part happened, right? And I think we can also see that this has been happening as well. So we're getting it from both ends. We have the Fed is flooding the economy with money, and we have had a major decline in the real economy. So, but the theory is at the Fed that this is all temporary enough where it's going to pan out. And then, of course, we can have bouts of deflation too, where the real economy stays at the size that it is, but for some reason the money supply shrinks. That can happen with international trade as well. And conversely, you can have a stable money supply with a growing real economy, and then you have deflation. And the Fed, of course, is attempting to prevent all of those scenarios of inflation or deflation, but they're concurrently pushing at all times for balanced growth. So that's got to be reformed, wildlifers, if we're to expect big picture, long-term wildlife conservation. And once again, one of the ways that we help to raise awareness of this is by pointing out that GDP has become an outstanding measure of environmental impact. In fact, you could even put carrying capacity for the human economy in terms of GDP. Because as you impact the environment, you are essentially pulling out the rug from your own economy and or exceeding carrying capacity. And then especially with the trophic theory of money, we recognize that, and we can add that the money supply itself, the generation of money through the liquidation of natural capital, is also an indicator of environmental impact. And in reality, GDP and the money supply are tightly linked. Well, I haven't been to a wildlife conference in a while. I need to start getting back to them, and I suppose the one this year would be, virtual too. But I do recall that for decades now, especially with a bachelor's degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, I know that for a long time now, sort of the lodestone for wildlifers in terms of philosophy and in terms of focus on the issues has been Aldo Leopold. And, we have to wonder what Aldo Leopold would say about all of the above. But actually, we don't have to speculate too much, because here's what he did say. Nothing could be more salutary at this stage than a little healthy contempt for a plethora of material blessings. Leopold was a early 20th century very artistic writer, and it's one of the reasons we appreciate his writing so much. It's so artistic, but this is a powerful statement, right? And the more you read of Leopold's latter writings in particular, the more you can see him veering toward the issue of economics in general, and in particular the macroeconomy. You know, he's not talking about any particular thing here. He's talking about material blessings, a plethora of material blessings. That's the macroeconomy. All the time in the news, consumer spending accounts for 72% of the American economy. But frankly, it doesn't really matter. It's all consumption, whether it's by private individuals or households or firms or the government. It's still material blessings, you might call it. But it doesn't come free. It comes at the expense, as he noted. This is why he said this. It comes at the expense of wildlife habitats and species and biodiversity at large. And I would also say about this quote by Leopold, and I think I was able to get this verified once by Kurt Miney, but this would have been his second from last observation ever published. Let me clarify that. The second from last sentence, because this came in the preface to a Sand County Almanac, and the preface was written after he wrote the book, and I believe it was the same year, which I want to say was about 1948, when he died of the heart attack fighting that fire in Wisconsin, I guess, in the Sand Counties in south central Wisconsin. And so he was heading our way, folks. We who are getting to the topic of the ecological macroeconomics of wildlife conservation. Well, that's about it for the talk, or for the slides at least. And now I would be happy to field any questions or engage with all of you in a general discussion. And I'm going to hit the stop sharing button now so I can see the regular screen. Or wait, I'll try hide. Wait a minute. Okay, I see Elitris.
Yes, wonderful. Can you hear me, Brian?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I had to get another computer that I couldn't get the audio working. That was really wonderful. And thank you, everyone. I apologize for the technological difficulties. I checked that computer 30 minutes before we started and everything was fine, but somehow in that 30 minutes, everything fell apart. Well, that was really fantastic. And Brian, that was just absolutely wonderful. You know, I think so many of us work on wildlife, but the root of all of these conflicts that we're devoting our life and careers to comes down to, you know, economics, and comes down to, you know, these big problems. Yet I think so many of us are deficient in these topics, so we really appreciate you, you know, translating that for us. I guess I'll start with a question, and then if anyone else has questions, feel free to either chime in or type them. But, you know, as we're talking to folks, especially right now in this crisis, it seems like, you know, COVID-19 was this amazing opportunity for us to realize that, you know, everything that we, you know, take for granted on a daily basis is fundamentally linked to the environment. But that's not what we've seen happen. We've you know, in most cases, we've seen kind of this backlash towards the environment. And I'd love for you to just kind of talk about your thoughts on why that is, and how can we move forward as wildlife professionals and talk to people who don't care, you know, about natural resources. Like what talking points would you give us to, you know, make us more productive and successful in addressing human wildlife conflicts and, you know, all the environmental catastrophes that are happening?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one way that helps is to make our audiences aware that we're not coming at this as some sort of, you know, far out tree hugger sort of, you know, approach. Not that there's anything wrong with trees. I love trees, but the salient point here is that the fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection is also, because of that trophic structure of the economy, it's a fundamental conflict between economic growth and the economy, the sustainability of the economy. So that means it's a fundamental conflict between economic growth and our kids and grandkids' jobs and income. And I think people are starting to recognize that. And then that extends naturally to another really huge issue, which is national security. If you want to have a secure nation, you can't have a tremendous amount of international strife. And you will have a tremendous amount of international strife when everybody out there is striving for GDP growth, because then we get into conflicts at borders in the Middle East, in the Caspian Sea Basin, in the South China Sea is becoming a real hotbed now. And so the fact is that just about every war that's been documented has had as a major element the competition for natural resources. And the more we approach that ultimate carrying capacity for planetary GDP, the bigger the world war type of scenario that develops then. The other thing, Alitris, I think, and you're aware of this, I remember, is that we have to stop seeding, CEDING, seeding the terrain of ecological macroeconomics to neoclassical economists. There are wonderful neoclassical economists in existence, but as a profession, they don't tend to get it about all of the rest of the species. So when it comes to the relationship between economic growth and wildlife conservation, we're the ones that have the most to bring to the table, because we're like the economist of nature.
That's a great way to put it. Wonderful. Are there any other questions before I kind of take over?
Put the light on.
I think while we're waiting, we're also live streaming this, so I'll share a few questions.
Oh, okay.
And let's see. I have one question coming to us from India that wanted to talk about. If you could please expand on what you see as far as impacting people in developing countries. And so if you could kind of talk about that. I think maybe this person is trying to ask specifically about India.
Okay. Well, that's another great question, and it ties right into the topic of international strife, because the planet has a capacity for GDP, and individual nations have capacities for GDP. And then what complicates things tremendously is international trade, in terms of where a country's sustainable GDP may or should lie. And like we identified finding the optimum GDP as the biggest challenge for democracy in the 21st century, that goes, especially in India, the biggest democracy on the planet. And it also goes for India in the very particular sense that there it's not so unlike the United States, where 4 times the ecological footprint of the 20th century came from increases in per capita consumption than population growth. I think the shoe is kind of on the other foot in India. Now, lately it's changed a lot. India's GDP per capita has grown a lot as well. But the point here is, what we need in international diplomacy is what we might call steady statesmanship. which starts with recognizing limits to GDP growth on a finite planet and those fundamental conflicts, that conflict between GDP growth and environmental protection, economic sustainability, national security, and international stability.
Wonderful. Brian, we've got a few really fantastic questions that have come in as well. Let's see, a question on, can you comment on calculating economic value of ecosystem services, please?
Yeah. So, well, at Cassie, we are all for it, but only when it is contextualized by or with ecological macroeconomics. Because if it is not, if it's done as a sort of an isolated study about only the value of, let's say, the water purification from the Catskills watershed, where does that lead us in terms of the discussion about limits to growth? It actually tends to lead us astray. It leads entities like, for example, the Nature Conservancy to get out there and tell the public and policymakers that there's no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment, because they're saying things like, hey, look, we protected this watershed and now we don't have to spend the $20 billion on water purification equipment and so on. But that you can't look at the relationship between economic growth and wildlife conservation via collection of microeconomic scenarios, because it's a systemic process. And in fact, there's a term that we like to use about the valuation of ecosystem services and natural capital in general. And let's see, what do we call that again? It's sort of like, if we're valuing these ecosystem services, why? Because we're recognizing that they're becoming rare. That's why the value is increasing. And the supply curve, in other words, is moving in. And so therefore a price starts to develop. And the problem is that in order to generate the money to pay that price, if we're going to try to market the ecosystem services, then all of a sudden the polity at large, if it's a public financing with taxes, we have to generate more money. And we know now that that comes from the agricultural and extractive surplus at the base of the economy. So it didn't help us. It's like a negative sum game because of thermodynamic losses. Nothing could have been done 100% efficiently. So to generate the money to purchase ecosystem services, we ended up liquidating.
Let's see, Brian, can you see the chats? There's some really great questions that have come through in the chats, and everyone, please feel free to unmute yourself, your microphone, and chime in if you'd like to ask the questions yourselves. There's some fantastic questions, comments, thoughts coming in. Let's see.
I can see one, and if it's okay, I would like to address Shishir Rao's question, which is about whether or not economists are trained to think about carrying capacity and stupid growth. No, not yet. I mean, little by little, they are encountering ecological economics. And by the way, there's sort of a distinction to be aware of there. If you're a wildlifer and you're new to this business, you may have heard the terms environmental economics and ecological economics. And environmental economics is simply a subset of neoclassical or conventional economics. that's applied to things like clean air and clean water and sometimes fisheries and wildlife. But it's a microeconomic exercise, kind of like the valuing of natural capital is. Whereas ecological economics comes from a different starting point, a different paradigmatic lens, you might say, where the economy is embedded in the ecosystem and it only does grow at the expense of the economy of nature. And so there really are very, very fundamentally distinct traditions by now, I guess you could say, of economics. And the general answer is that no, the conventional economists, like out of the University of Chicago or Stanford or MIT, and most places in the rest of the world that I'm aware of, are getting the basic old production is a function of capital and labor. And that right away is a very limited starting point in terms of understanding limits to growth.
Could you just comment briefly on the Donut Economics by Kate Raworth at Oxford?
Well, at Cassie, we think it's good stuff. You know, Kate Raworth, she recognizes limits to growth very clearly, and she uses some of the state-of-the-art findings about limits to growth to develop that donut model of the economy. And so we're all for it, yeah. Kate Raworth is a signatory of ours too. You know, we tend to cut straight to the chase of the fundamental conflict between economic growth and those things that we were talking about. And one of the ways we do help, you asked this earlier, Leitris, what can we do about this? And one way we do it is taking positions on it. So like the Wildlife Society took a position on economic growth, I think it was in 2004, and then it was actually strengthened maybe around 2008, 2009. And the Society for Conservation Biology, the main part of it at least, took a position on economic growth. And so as the American Society of Mammalogists, and so on. And Kate's work, I think, Kate's is a little more academic, and it's gear, I think it has more circulation in Europe, whereas our work with Cassie and advancing the steady state economy is probably a little more prominent in the US. But we do overlap quite a bit.
Great. Let's see. There are a few more questions and thoughts. Reg was asked about your thoughts on the triple bottom line.
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that.
I'm sorry.
I think it's not something I'm qualified to speak to enough to do so. But
Okay.
I do think that it tends to not quite make it all the way there to the ecological macro. I mean, it's more of an accounting exercise with an attempt to account for, you know, not just the money and not just the goods and services. But on the other hand, I think it goes about it pretty much in the same accounting fashion without necessarily recognizing a limit to the trio. And by the way, I did see questions about blockchain currency too. That's another one. I don't personally care to go there too much. The only thing I'm going to say about monetary policy, probably for this audience, is that in our efforts to get the Full Seas Act passed, we want the Fed to go back to what it was originally designed to do, which is simply to keep inflation at bay, to stabilize the money supply in relation to the real economy. After the 1978 Act was passed, that's what got the Fed into the growth game, you know, the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. So and those economists going back to the earlier question about what economists are trained in, the monetary economists tend to have the least of all training in ecological economics and limits to growth and the conflict.
More. So, Brian, we've a few people kind of touched on this, but we're always asking for kind of talking points or advice. Like, how do you, when you come across a policymaker or someone who has, zero interest in wildlife or, natural resource conservation, and you're trying to make a connection and make them care about why conserving natural resources is important to them. Could you please kind of break down your thoughts on your talking points and how you go about doing that?
Well, the main strategy at this point in history is to get our allies more involved. I mean, once in a while, we do test the waters a little bit with politicians that have virtually no background of this type that we're talking about. But so far, the testing of the waters isn't that productive because the politician is more about empowerment. I mean, the politician cares about the votes and the money, the campaign money. We got to remember that. Politicians are not typically all about doing the best thing for, they're counting on the democratic philosophy that by representing a cohort of the, in this case, American population, that they are doing the right thing. So they're very much dependent on constituents. So that said, if, however, we do find a politician that may have an open mind, like the Lieutenant Governor of Vermont signed the Cassie position this past winter, and this fellow may very well be a future governor of Vermont and beyond. He had some interest already. He's a farmer. He's a small farmer on the side, and so if there is some interest, then it's relatively easy process for them to become aware that wildlife is part of a healthy ecosystem. I showed some of those slides before with that ridiculous factory farmed, whatever it was, Roundup Ready soybean field, or there was a wheat field too, I think, with about 40 different tractors lined up. That's not a healthy ecosystem. And you can tell it's not because there's no wildlife. And most politicians do have some hunting and fishing constituency. So that's another thing we got to really work on this, I think, is getting the hook and bullet crowd in to get some, get some skin in the game by them. They have a lot to lose here. Yeah, for a while, we can have an economy grow and we lose the stuff that hunters don't care about necessarily too much. But eventually, we start losing the stuff that the hunters do care about as well. So we've got to get that point across to them, get them working at the political level because of that. But yeah, Leitris, I still think it goes, the logical message, for what that's worth to a typical politician, is that the push for perpetual GDP growth, the perpetual push for perpetual GDP growth, is not only decimating green space, wildlife habitats, and wildlife populations and species, but it is literally, you could say, given the trophic structure, pulling the rug out from their own kids, their constituents' kids and grandkids' economy. It's sort of, and we can use all kinds of metaphors, like a human body, for example. You can't have perpetual growth of that. You get to a healthy weight on the scale, and that's what you strive to maintain then. And it's very similar with the body economic, we might call it.
Great. Well, thank you. A really fantastic comment and question from Neil. Is there any school of thought around limiting international trade by sphere, geographic or by market, to in some way constrain the resources that a country can leverage in growth to its GDP?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot of great questions here.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, I'm glad that person thought of that, because we happen to have a proposal as part of our efforts to round up the best ideas for the Full and Sustainable Employment Act, a proposal for a distance tax that would, in fact, have the net result of shrinking the supply chains, and would then, in other words, favor, all else equal, it definitely would favor national or domestic trade versus international trade. And I think we'll be coming out with this proposal very soon. You know, Cassie, we only have 4 people, 4 staff, and we run largely on intern power. So I want to throw that out there, Alitris. If anyone is interested in working on issues like this, like for a semester as a student, chances are we would be interested in having you on as a Cassie intern. And obviously we do that from a distance right now with the COVID-19. And also, I hope people will join Cassie. I mean, we made it as non-toxic as possible to join Cassie as a nice little primer of
Oh, and then Brian, can you, this last question that just came through, since economic growth is at variance with natural resource conservation, what should conservationists in developing economies do where the drive is towards development?
Well, I think all you can do is raise awareness of what is at stake in the drive for development. The word development, we sometimes try for rhetorical and political purposes to separate that from growth per se. So we say that, you know, economic growth is increasing production and consumption. Development technically doesn't have to entail GDP growth, but in conventional economics, yeah, it tends to be conflated all the time with growth, especially growth of GDP per capita. That's sometimes considered to be like the primary indicator of development, GDP per capita. So what should conservationists do? It really depends a lot on the so-called developing country. If there's widespread poverty, frankly, you need economic growth. You know, nobody anywhere that I'm aware of has ever been saying that no economy anywhere should be growing. If there's dire poverty, they need growth. But that's why we need, even more so, we need this steady statesmanship in international diplomacy, so that big, wealthy, if I may say, bloated economies in the so-called West, in the developed North, we've got to put a stop to that obsession with GDP growth, move toward a steady state economy. And Alitris, you were right before too about, you know, this COVID episode could be a decent chance to sort of retrench on that GDP growth goal. Now we've gone through some degrowth. How about degrowth toward a more sustainable steady state economy? And then we can help other countries where there's widespread poverty and people trying to come to the USA and Northern European countries. If we make it better for them where they really want to be at home, you know, that alleviates two problems at once. So steady statesmanship in international diplomacy is crucial, more crucial every year.
Great point. I think that's a wonderful point to maybe end on. And I think that so much of what you spoke to, Brian, is just fundamentally, it's the root cause for everything that I think all of us are so concerned with, rightfully so, and working towards trying to alleviate. So I really appreciate you, bridging this gap for us and all of your work. And we will be posting this as well, so people will be able to watch this presentation. And if it's all right with you, have a link to Cassie, so that hopefully other folks can sign on and become a member in your important organization. I didn't get a chance to introduce Brian because of our technical difficulties, but in addition to all of his incredible work, he's published just a plethora of papers and an enormous amount of books, including this one that he alluded to. So I'll put this plug out. There's a lot of great information in here that I think it should be on the bookshelf of all wildlife professionals to try to help us understand what we're up against with these uphill battles that we're all dealing with. So if you could please just join me in thanking Brian for his time. That was really an amazing talk, so we appreciate it. And I will encourage you to please join us next month for our Conservation Colloquy, Wildlife Wednesday, which is a transdisciplinary platform to talk about, address, unravel these global problems between wildlife and people. And so our next Conservation Colloquy will be the 7th of October. Again, it's the first Wednesday of every month. And we will announce in a couple weeks our speaker, but she is absolutely amazing, so stay tuned. And I just want to thank everyone, but particularly thank Brian for this really important work. I know that sometimes it was almost like pulling teeth, getting a bunch of conservationists and wildlife professionals to understand and step out of our comfort zone and sign on to why this is so important. I think some of us get tunnel vision and focusing on the problem that we're dealing with every day and trying to alleviate these human wildlife conflicts. And we really need to take a step back and look at the whole picture. And that's really what you have done throughout your whole career, especially with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But that's what you're helping us do. And so we really, really appreciate that from the bottom of our hearts. So thank you so much for that. And
thank you, Aletris.
For joining us.
Thanks to everybody for, coming to the talk today.
And enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you joined us from in the world. So thank you again so much. And Brian, I'll be in contact soon.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful. Thanks.